we have Dragos Maciuca from Ford. Dragos is the Executive Technical Director at Ford Research and Innovation Center in Palo Alto, and he has also been one of our earliest partners and passionate supporters of the XTC. So we are very happy about that relationship with Dragos. He will be speaking to us today on new mobility and innovation at Ford. So take it away, Dragos.
Morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Let me start sharing my screen here. So quick discussion today on the automotive industry and things in mobility in general, because honestly, we can't just talk about automotive anymore. It's the whole mobility space is changing, and where do the startups come into play in this space? So first, quick background on me. I'm running the technology office for Ford in Palo Alto. I've been doing this for a bit over 5 years. Before that, I had a kind of tour of the Valley working in for Apple, Lockheed, KLA, so different industries, but all of them based in the Valley. And oddly enough, I started with a PhD in autonomous vehicles too early, 20 years too early, because, you know, in this space, being too early is almost as bad as being too late. So there was no way I was going to do a startup in this space in autonomous vehicles 20 years ago. So, you know, keep in mind, timing does matter. Just a bit about our innovation center. It's one of four that Ford has. We started with obviously the one in Dearborn, Michigan, where the headquarters are. There was one in Aachen, Germany, for quite a while. We opened ours in Silicon Valley about 5 years ago, and we recently also opened one in Israel. Obviously, another hotbed for startups, and I'm going to touch a little bit on that shortly. So what are we focusing on? And you can see from this is that it's not really a focus, and I'm very careful when people ask us what we're focusing on to not be too narrow. And the reason I'm saying that is that we're interested in a lot of things. Basically, the easiest thing to describe this is what we're not interested in. So we're not interested in engines, transmissions, suspensions, sheet metal bending, sort of the traditional part of the automotive industry, even though even in those spaces, there may be little niche areas that could become interesting. So we're really interested in all the changes that are coming to our industry, that the Valley is really versed on. But again, we're geographically agnostic, so we're not limited to just Silicon Valley. So in general, we're interested in obviously autonomy and everything that entails. And by autonomy, I mean level 4, level 3, ADAS, anything with manufacturing, even robots, bipeds, or all kinds of delivery robots, compute platforms, sensors, machine learning, obviously, cybersecurity, data analytics. So all these things that, again, are relatively new to an industry that's been manufacturing centric, mechanical engineering centric, that now needs to absorb all these technologies in a sort of in a continuum basis. Another reason why we're here is that the entire space of the automotive industry is changing dramatically in how it operates. So it used to be this pyramid of OEMs buying from tier 1s, buying from tier 2s, buying from tier 3s, and it was a relatively known process, and we kind of knew how things are going in a very consistent way year to year. Now it's becoming this ecosystem. Sometimes I describe it almost like an amoeba, that we connect from different places. We all look at technologies that are coming from different areas that may have nothing to do with the automotive industry. We may talk directly with a tier 3 supplier. It doesn't mean we're going to eliminate the tier 1s and tier 2s. It's just that we're all end up trying to get to the technology faster, trying to absorb it faster. In just the past year, I've had numerous discussions with with the semi industry. So this is our semiconductor manufacturing industry. So those are the guys that make the tools for semiconductors, like Applied Materials and KLA and Lam. We didn't have to talk to them because there was usually a gap of about 6-7 companies between them and us, and a gap of 6 or 7 years between when the semiconductor tool was made and when we got to use it, when we got to use the chips. Now everyone is trying to understand how things are moving in the near future, because that gap is being reduced from 6, 7, maybe even 10 years down to a couple of years. And by the time the semiconductor industry makes their tools, we need to already grab the chips on the first production. So things are changing dramatically, and that's why we need to be here and understand the space. And again, with traditional suppliers, like if you're looking at that pyramid, you get technologies that are almost ready. They understand our requirements ahead of time. We have a long-term relationship, so it's a relatively easy discussion. With startups, you typically get the technology at a much earlier stage. You need to guide them through understanding our industry, which is much more highly regulated than consumer electronics. And the timelines between when they need revenue and when we can provide that, typically there's a discrepancy there. So why even bother with startups? Well, the reason is that if you rely strictly on the tier 1 suppliers, everyone gets the same technology. It gets filtered through their business models. We could be late to market because the technology needs to be processed through their processes before we get it. And in particular, in this world of software, a lot of times we get black box software, so we don't know what's inside. So working with startups, it allows us to get a differentiator in terms of technology. Allows us to get to technology a lot sooner. It allows us to co-develop and guide that technology. It doesn't mean, again, that we're going to eliminate the tier 1 suppliers. A lot of times, we actually form that triangle between tier 1s and startups and us in order to get something that's beneficial to everyone. But again, there's a very important place for startups to come in. Quick discussion on how we got here. I started with BMW back in 99. Mercedes was the first company to come to the Valley back in 97. And then a few other companies showed up, and really up until 2014, this was the map of the intersection of Silicon Valley with the automotive industry. So there were only basically a handful of car companies that had a presence in the Valley and looking at the technologies that you can get from here. And then a couple of years later, you start seeing a lot more tier 1 suppliers show up. You start seeing, more importantly, startups that were dedicated to the automotive industry, because until then, the VCs had no interest in funding anything to do with the automotive industry. They thought we're slow and stupid, and they didn't have any need for this industry. Bit by bit, some niche VCs started funding startups specifically dedicated to the automotive industry, and you start seeing these startups pop up. And then the ecosystem starts building up. This was 2017, 2018, 2019, and this is just a couple of months ago. So the whole ecosystem exploded in the last few years, and we started speaking a more common language. They started understanding that we need software. We started understanding better how machine learning can help us. So this whole ecosystem started building up, and there are more and more VCs that are now funding startups that are dedicated to the automotive industry. That doesn't mean that we're still not going to be able to transfer technology from other applications. But again, this intersection between Silicon Valley and the automotive industry has been absolutely tremendous. And even if you look at the media, until about 3-4 years ago, this whole thing was presented as Silicon Valley versus the automotive industry. For the last 3 years or so, the discussion has clearly been Silicon Valley and the automotive industry. How is transportation transforming? Keep in mind that this is something, this kind of transformation happens, once every 50 years, once a century, but it can happen really fast. So just as an example, at the turn of the other century, this was New York City, so packed with horse-drawn carriages, and there was one car in that picture. Only 13 years later, it's all cars and one single horse-drawn carriage. So things like this can happen very quickly, and that's why we're here to be able to absorb and speed up that transformation. Other things that are affecting mobility is all the changes around the mobility space. So robotics and autonomy. Basically, autonomous vehicles are nothing but robots on wheels. The changes that have happened in machine learning in the last 5 years or so, that are enabling autonomy. Sensors and compute platforms that were not available until recently, that have tremendous compute power to allow us to put in autonomy. And importantly, the consumer pool to have the car connected just like any other device, because right now the car is probably the only last space that you have where you're not connected as well as you are with the other devices that you have around you. And all this leads to changes that are absolutely dramatic for this industry. We typically call them ACEs. So you're talking about autonomous vehicles, connected, electrified, and shared. And if you look at each one of them individually, they're all the exact opposite than what this industry was used to until very recently. So cars used to be all about the pleasure of driving. It used to be about how the vehicle behaved. It used to be about the vehicle dynamics. Now with autonomy, it's all about a robot driving, and it's about the utility of moving from point A to point B. So that whole thing is completely changing, and how you would sell a vehicle. It's going to be a lot harder to sell it based on how it looks and how it drives versus how much utility you have and how good it feels inside rather than outside. Connected, as I said, vehicles used to be the last device that you don't have connected. Now we're going to connect all the vehicles and be able to transfer data back and forth. Internal combustion engine has been proposing us for the last 100 years. Clearly, there are major changes coming in terms of electrification. And last, shared. Again, the vehicle used to be something that you love, that you own, that you looked at, that was sitting in the garage, or in some cases in the driveway, but it was yours and you had that connection with it. Now, when it's a shared world, you don't really care necessarily what it looks like. You don't care what brand it is. It's a completely different space that we're moving into. In terms of autonomy, really quick, going through the levels of autonomy that we're looking at. You have these 6 levels of autonomy, where 0 is absolutely no autonomy. Most of us are currently at level 1. We're working towards level 2. But again, even though there's a continuum in terms of numbers, there's going to be this really hard cut between level 3 and level 4. So level 3, it will still be a personally owned vehicle. It will still be something that you drive at times. It will still be something that still needs to look good in your driveway. Level 4 is the first level where there will be no steering wheel, no pedals, and the vehicle takes care of everything. And most likely, those vehicles will be owned by a fleet, and you'll use them as a service. So there's really a hard cut between level 3 and level 4. It's also in terms of how we work. Level 3 is a progression from previous levels of autonomy. Level 4, in most cases, starts coming down from level 5, which we can argue about it, but personally, I think it will never happen, because level 5 is full autonomy under any condition, under any circumstance, no matter what. It's all a case of both technology being very hard and business model not necessarily making sense. So there's going to be this intersection between the two levels, between level 3 and level 4. Each part of the world has different approaches to the autonomy. Typically in Asia and Europe, people are looking more at sort of these people mover bots, mini buses, mini pods. In the US and China, we're looking more at robo taxis. Now that the space is actually expanding in both directions. So there are startups that are coming in on sort of 18-wheeler long distance, city edge to city edge type delivery. I like to put that in the bucket of high speed, low chaos. At the other extreme, you have these delivery bots, which probably we're going to see more sped up by COVID, where you have delivery bots that operate in the other quadrant, which is low speed, high chaos. Robo taxis are sort of in the more difficult quadrant where you have high speed and high chaos. And then, kind of referencing back to that earlier slide of this whole world kind of changing, we're starting to see competition coming in from all kinds of different areas. Like we used to know that other OEMs are our competitors, and they still are. But now we're seeing competition coming in from software company. We're trying to see competition coming from services companies. So again, it's a much more dynamic world that we live in. Last thing I would say is the huge impact that software is having in our world. When you used to say car, this was the first image that would come to mind, or something similar. So it's this mechanical device on wheels, typically not connected. And once you make it, you don't really have to worry about it because mechanical things are much harder to change. In the future, and we're already starting to look at this, this is pretty much what you need to start thinking of when you think of a car. So both inside the vehicle and outside. So the car itself, it will be this compute device that has edge compute at every sensor area, and then a centralized compute device. But then the cars themselves become edge compute devices with a centralized area, either geographically because you have relevant information in a particular area, or going back to our headquarters and analyzing the entire fleet of vehicles. So data becomes a lot more important. And then now you start getting connected with cities, starting connected with third parties through APIs. So software in vehicles and how vehicles are connected through software becomes a lot more important. What's our role here in Palo Alto? It's really the role to be that bridge between these two worlds, between the world of the startups that moves fast but may not know exactly how to work with a large corporation and where exactly to fit in, and how to survive this gap between a great idea and a great product. But also we're trying to move forward in the modern direction of the startup. So, when I was talking earlier about being slow, there are areas where we can certainly learn from startups where, like in case of the infotainment, it makes sense to move faster and release versions sooner and correct things with over-the-air updates. But also the Valley needs to understand that this is a device that's highly regulated, and if you move fast and break things, which is what the Valley likes to do, you might actually kill someone. So the two worlds need to understand each other and work with each other in order to create this coherent product that's both a consumer device and also a highly regulated safety device. So what do we need from the startup community? We still need perception. We're looking at 80 LiDAR companies. We started with 2 5 years ago. Now we're looking at 80. We still need that ideal solid state sensor that costs, tens of dollars, maybe $100, that can see 300 meters and has high resolution. We're seeing work in that direction. We don't have that product yet, but we're still looking for something like this. We're starting to see now this fusion between different types of sensors, both at the hardware level and the software level. So radar and LiDAR are kind of fusing into each other, or higher resolution radar, or maybe active illumination, but you read with a CCD, just like a camera. There's this combination that's coming in, and so we need to absorb all these changes that are coming, and we're still very interested in looking at this space. Huge changes happening in the AI chip space. There used to be only GPUs from NVIDIA. Now we're tracking some 50 companies that are making silicon dedicated to machine learning. We have, Silicon Valley has finally invested in silicon again for more in the last year than in previous 10. And obviously, as I was talking about earlier, we're very interested in reliability and safety. So how these products come in, change our world, but at the same time still keep it safe. That's all I have in terms of the presentation. So I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Dragos. That was fascinating, especially the map you showed of the Auto Lab of how the automotive industry has come together with Silicon Valley. Fantastic. uh, we'll stay tuned for any questions coming in from the audience. Please raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature, or type your question in the chat. While we wait, there is one question, Dragos. How can startups work with Ford, and how can you help?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we see ourselves as being that bridge between the two worlds. So we understand both the startup world and Ford. So the easiest thing for startups is to reach out to us in the Valley, and again, because we're much more used to working with startups than our colleagues back in Michigan, who are more used with working with tier one suppliers. Now, to be honest, after 5 years being here, a lot of our colleagues in Michigan totally get it now. But it's still a lot easier if they reach out to us. We do that initial filtering. We may be able to do a proof of concept. We may be able to guide them a lot better and then connect them with the right people within Ford. Because a lot of times we get some startup that says, well, I talked to Ford. I'm like, well, who is Ford? In what department? And what did they want from you? How did you explain it? So we are that translator. We are that glue between the two worlds, and we're happy to be the Sherpas of the startups as they go through this space. And we fought really hard for startups in terms of terms and conditions, in terms of financing, in terms of, I mean, we took startups from literally from a garage to the assembly line, and so we know how to navigate all these concerns that happen when you're trying to put something where there's a huge impedance mismatch.
And I remember, Douglas, when we met first and we were talking about some of the areas that you look at and Ford is interested in. Obviously, transportation is one of those areas, but along with that, associated areas like clean tech, et cetera, are also interesting. So could you give us some idea of what kind of startups in which areas do you actually talk to?
Yeah, so you touched upon some good ones. So sustainability is important. Autonomy is important, but we're interested in materials like recyclable materials. We're interested in design. We're interested in manufacturing. So we look very broadly. We don't look just at the vehicle itself and what we can put in there, but everything from manufacturing to advertising platforms for dealers, and more recently, new business models, in particular in terms of data. Again, this is an industry that for a long time has known how to make money by selling you the widget, the thing, the device, the atoms. Now we're starting to move towards an industry that needs to make money with data, with bits, with ephemeral things. So anything in that space is also important. So we're interested in fintech also for financing, for forex. So just because you don't have automotive in your pitch doesn't mean we're not interested in you. So we have a very broad interest. Now, on the other hand, there are certain areas which are very unique to the automotive industry. So when it comes to cybersecurity, the vehicle architecture is very different than a laptop or a phone. As much as we try to say that nowadays, cars are just phones on wheels, there are a lot of differences in that architecture. So when it comes to certain areas, you really need to understand our world really well. When it comes to other areas, we can easily transform from one application to the automotive industry.
And while we were chatting, Douglas, there was a question from JP Ellis, and I'll summarize the question. He lives in an emerging market area where they have vast amounts of entry-level vehicles, both two-wheelers and four-wheelers. So he would like to get a sense and your perspective over the next 20 years in emerging markets. What might it look like for the four-wheelers and the two-wheelers?
Yeah, and I think this is a particularly exciting area because again, as cars adapt a lot more software and electronics, you can do a lot of interesting things with with entry-level vehicles, that maybe you don't need the infotainment to be built in. Maybe you can have a lot of information coming in through your devices, through your phone. Maybe because of the electric vehicles, you don't need to have the engine and the infrastructure that comes with it. And you're moving to electric vehicles that don't necessarily have to look like a car, but it can be pods for maybe two people. Maybe it's the form factor, in other words, is going to change. I'm also excited from that point of view in terms of pollution, particularly in areas where internal combustion engines are maybe not as regulated as in the US. If you switch to electric vehicles, it becomes inherently clean. So honestly, I wish I knew what this world is going to look like in 10, 20 years. The only thing I can say is that this decade is a decade of inflection. Things are going to change more during this decade than probably in the previous 50 years. It's going to be a fundamental change that will happen, and there are literally trillions of dollars of experiments around the world in terms of transportation. And we don't know, honestly, we don't know what this will look like. Are UAVs going to win? Are electric vehicles going to win? What form of autonomy? There's so many unknowns right now, but that's basically what's happening right now. It's a huge churn, and there'll be a lot of winners, and obviously there'll be a lot of losers.
That is so interesting. Rajiv, may I just ask a quick follow-up? Okay, thank you. You touched on the internal combustion engine, and obviously, gasoline and petrol, but, in a lot of these emerging markets where, emissions are not regulated and there's a lot of old vehicles out, a lot of these markets are also heavily government subsidized petrol, right? So I guess do you have a sense of what is the key thing? Is it the actual vehicle design, or is it more in terms of battery and having kind of a price per effective kilometer or whatever that's actually cheaper than what a government can subsidize petrol for?
Yeah, I think it is. It's a mix between those. So definitely the price of electric powertrains is coming down. Most estimates see a parity happening around 2035. To be honest, that's the one estimate we've been wrong in the right direction, as in every time we estimated a year when the parity will happen, the year moves closer and closer. So maybe it will happen actually sooner than 2035. There's also a matter of infrastructure. Can you get reliable electricity? Can you get enough areas where you can charge fast enough? From what I'm reading, that the fastest growing electric vehicle are actually electric bicycles. So again, the form factor doesn't necessarily have to be the car as we know it today. So I think part of it is that it's bringing the cost down, but part of it is obviously regulations. Governments certainly have a role in terms of subsidizing or not, in demanding certain levels of emissions or not. So it's really a mix between consumer demand, price points, and government regulations.
That is so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dragos, for that exciting presentation. Perfect timing. So appreciate you being here and joining us, and your continued support to the XTC. We will now move on.
I love to be part of this community. This is awesome. So glad to be here.
Thank you, Dragos.